To secede or not to secede, that is the conversation that we focus on tonight. The National Super Alliance has reignited its agenda for self-determination, claiming the government continues to deliberately neglect regions where opposition enjoys massive support. NASA members of parliament today revisited the issue of ownership of Migingo Island. They claim Ugandan authorities mistreat Kenyan fishermen on islands bordering Uganda. The legislators based their call for separation on Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution of Kenya that states the people may exercise their sovereign power either directly or through their democratically elected representatives. Is it the right time for such a call given the current state of the nation?
Here today, if the government is tired of Nyanza, we are ready to go alone. We cannot force ourselves in a barricade. It's not working. Let them declare. We have to redefine our relations with this government. But we are not going to force ourselves in a relationship where we are not benefiting. We are only being milked dry. We are Kenyans and we have a right to get our rightful share in this government. We are not pleading for it. We are demanding.
And this is the big story. I'm Lindo Gutu sitting in for Yvonne Okwara Matole. So in a couple of minutes, we'll be speaking to Uriri Member of Parliament, Mark Nyamita, who's already in studio with us, just to help us dissect a little bit of this and where exactly the region and indeed the leaders are heading to with this conversation. We'll also be speaking to Javas Bigambo. He's a governance expert. He should be here any minute from now. But for now, let me take you to my colleague, Sophia Wanuna, who is having a conversation with the leader of Majority, Eden Duale, on the same. Sophia.
Thank you very much, Linda, and a very good evening to you. We are at the office of the Leader of Majority in the National Assembly, Eden Duale, and I want to begin with that hot topic, the secession debate that is currently ongoing following the announcement from the leadership in Mombasa County as well as Kilifi County, saying they intend to begin the process to secede from Kenya. Thank you so much for making time for us. Let's begin with that debate, and that has reignited a lot of conversations. It's not the first time you're hearing secession, but this time around, two county governments making it clear of their intention to do the same.
Number one, I think if you read Article 5 of the Constitution, it protects the territorial integrity, both in terms of land and water, of the country called Kenya. So I don't see any provision in the Constitution that can allow for the subdivision of the great nation called Kenya. But what are the reasons for secession? The reasons for secession, according to the leadership of those two counties, is about marginalization in terms of resources, in terms of inclusion in government. One, the Constitution, and I have said it many times, the Constitution of Kenya 2010 has created solutions to each and every challenge or problem that is found within the Kenyan society. The advent of a devolved system of government in the 47 counties and having their own share of resources and their own governance structure was to cure the element and the cry of many regions in our country in as far as marginalization is concerned. For example, Kilifi County, because of the poverty level, because of the population size, Kilifi County is one of the counties in our country that receives over 9 billion shillings every year. So before we cry marginalization, the leadership in those counties should have asked themselves, what have we done with the devolution? How many laws have we passed? What resources? Today, poverty level in Kilifi, and more so in some parts of Kilifi like Ganse, is still as high as when President President Moi was in office. Yeah. So we need to redefine and reevaluate the success of devolution.
Before we talk about secession.
Yes. Secondly, in terms of inclusion in the national government, there are key leaders who are the Chief of Defense Forces comes from Kilifi. The commander of the Kenyan naval officers, Navy, comes from Coast. The Minister of Mining comes from Kilifi. the Minister for Tourism, and a host of other leaders. Yeah. So they can't cry inclusion. But I think the problem is that we are not addressing and using the structures that are available within the framework of the Constitution to address the challenges we're facing in various parts of the country.
Let's go back to whether they can secede and whether there's a constitutional provision for that, because you say there is none. However, there are those who argue Article 255 1B, talking about the territory of Kenya and through way of referendum, can actually happen.
Yes, I mean, through a referendum. But I'm saying in Article 5 of the Constitution, it defines the territory of Kenya, both in terms of land and water. So for you to secede, then you must amend certain provisions of the Constitution. But let us not.
Sovereign people is with the people of Kenya. So leader of majority, if they, for example, manage to get all the requisite signatures, we go to a referendum, and a particular region shows they do not want to be part of Kenya, they want to be in this particular part. The sovereign will, the sovereign power is with the people, isn't it?
If you read Article 1 and 2 of the Constitution, and this is where people, and my friends, particularly the NASA coalition, don't want to finish the whole of that article. It says sovereign will belongs to the people, and it will be exercised in accordance with the Constitution. So they leave that part. If you want to conduct a referendum in our country, or if you want to amend the Constitution, the routes are two, either through a parliamentary initiative or through a popular initiative. So those who are telling us that the sovereignty will belongs to the sovereignty will of the nation, of the power belongs to the people, they should also finish that article and say, in accordance with the Constitution. I mean, an individual, a citizen cannot say that the sovereignty will belongs to me and I will exercise it according to me. So how the citizen will exercise the sovereignty power is again documented in the Constitution.
So we talk about, and you have mentioned the inclusion of some of these individuals from various communities in government. But we know that is not what uniting a country is all about. That is not what makes people feel included and part of. And yet it appears to be the narrative in government that we have employed so and so, we have this and these people in government. So clearly there's something the Jubilee government is missing when there are still people who don't feel part of Kenya.
Let me tell you, Constitution of Kenya 2010 has made sure that in every sphere of government or any of the arms of government, certain parameters must be considered in order to fulfill the criteria for inclusivity. The Constitution supersedes that the president informing his government. It says, first, it gives him the number of cabinet ministers he must form. He must create. It tells him it must have regional diversity. It must have gender balance. It must have people with a disability. So the Constitution has created a framework that ultimately, forces the holder of that office to deal with the element of inclusivity. And that's why the same Constitution has given Parliament as a check of the executive, that if the president decides to form a government that is not inclusive, that does not represent the regional face of our country, the ethnic diversity of our country. That is why names, when they're sent to Parliament, Parliament in its wisdom must make sure that the list sent to Parliament must meet the constitutional threshold. Secondly, inclusivity is about resources. If you look at this government, the Jubilee administration, in the last 5 years, one of the things that Jubilee administration did was equity in terms of making sure that each and every aspect of its transformation agenda goes to each part of the country. And I'll give you a good example. It's only this government that for the first time in the history of Kenya, in all the successive governments, has taken the national grid electricity to northern Kenya, to Garissa. Yeah. It's the first time you see in the history of this country that you can drive from here to Moyale since independence. Yes. It's the first time you see, if you look at the establishment of the road network in our country, that Kilifi gets similar allocation as Bondo or Siaya. Yeah. So regardless of where you vote, and that's why we say 7.5 million people have voted for President Uhuru Kenyatta. But the day President Uhuru Kenyatta will be sworn in, he will not become the president of the 7.5 million. He becomes the president of the 45 million plus Kenyans.
All right, and that we have had Jubilee talk about its successes, but yet you talk about 7 million plus Kenyans voting for him, turnout being about, 38%. The question of legitimacy has been put out. It is well that there's all these things that Jubilee has done in money and all, but the question still remains, fulfilling that the spirit of the Constitution, so that on one hand, Jubilee has done 1, 2, 3, but is it being felt at the grassroots level? Because 2013 election, President Kenyatta, again, coming into office with a divided nation, if he is sworn in, he has clearly not been able to resolve that issue. So whilst people are talking about secession, today we had Siaya County Assembly pass that motion on the People's Assembly. There is a momentum that's growing, sir.
No, there's no momentum. It's a creation of figment imagination of many people. But let me go one by one. Number one, I think if you go to the factual, the Jubilee administration in the last 5 years, in terms of its development agenda, the equity, the distribution across different regions of our country, in terms of, if you look at the 3 million people who got connected to electricity, they are across the country, in terms of roads, in terms of health infrastructure. The equity is there. But you raised the...
It's not been felt.
But you have raised they are felt. I mean, there are more Kenyans who have now power in their houses than there were 3.5 million Kenyans. There are Kenyans today who can access better health care in Mandera and Marsabit than they were there. There are over thousands of Kenyans, millions, who now access the Social Security Fund before Uhuru Kenyatta came to power. But let me raise the issue of legitimacy. Legitimacy is not a pedestrian statement. Legitimacy is found in the Constitution. For one to have the legitimacy to lead the country, there are certain constitutional thresholds. Number one, the president must win in over 24 counties. The president must get 50 plus 1. The president must have votes in every of the majority of the constituencies. Right. Okay? Yes. So those are the thresholds. The case now before the Supreme Court. Yes. That's a legitimate test. If the Supreme Court finds that there is no merit in those petitions, that is a legitimacy stamp to show that President Uhuru Kenyatta was duly elected. So you know, legitimacy in the reading of the Constitution, the threshold and the parameters have been provided. So, they are not, you know, the kind of words we use when we're having a cup of tea and mandazi.
So those who feel not part of, not included, excluded, you say there's no merit in their feelings, they are what?
You know, the question of who is not included. Today, if you ask me... You
have a view, but they also feel that way. So what do you tell those people who genuinely don't feel that?
Let me ask you a good question. Yes. Let's take Western Kenya. And let's take an example as a cabinet composition. Okay? We have 2 members from the western part of Kenya, Honorable Eugene Wamalwa and Honorable Professor Judy Wahungu. I mean, if the people of that region say we are not included in the cabinet just because those 2 they are preferred, then that is not about inclusion. If we have Rachel Omamo as coming from development committees in, as far as I can remember, 288 constituencies. These committees, which have now been approved this afternoon, will be gazetted by the board. And then the first disbursement of the resources to the members will be disbursed next week. Okay. Ideally, the financial year, 50% must be given to them. So this was delayed because of the prolonged electioneering period. Right. So that was one very, very important. So we wanted members to go back to their constituencies, sit with their constituency members, agree on the projects, do evaluation, and set. Yeah. The second thing was the court leadership, because the next agenda we were supposed to do was the element of critical to the House on the formation of the various committees. Yes. Jubilee alone could have formed committees. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have done it. We have the House Business Committee up and running. But we wanted to form the other committees. But we received a letter from the from the NASA coalition leadership saying that because a number of their key principles are out of the country, they indulge the speaker and myself that we give them period until 29th of this month when they can come and exhaustively and conclusively fill the House leadership and agree to form the various committees. Even today, we have formed two committees, the Parliamentary Pension Committee, and we formed the East Africa Legislative Assembly Oversight Committee. And both sides of the coalition, NASA gave us names, Jubilee names, so we are working. But because of the absence of their key leaders, they have asked for 2 weeks. And I think there's nothing wrong sometimes in being magnanimous and agreeing to my colleagues on the other side.
Yes. Many thanks. Thank you so much for making time for the big story tonight. Leader of the majority in the National Assembly, Aden Duale. Linda, back to you.
Sophia, thank you so much. So before we get into this conversation, let's listen in to Nyatike Member of Parliament, Tom Odege. There are several reasons why leaders from that region are saying they want to secede. They're talking about inclusion, economic marginalization. Let's listen in a little bit to what he had to say earlier on today.
As the people of Nyatike, so long as we have the flag of Uganda in our constituency, we'll continue resisting. We cannot be colonized in our own country, and we purport to be in a government which is silent, a government which is in bed sleeping.
Allow me, you're watching The Big Story, so allow me to reintroduce my guests tonight. We have Javas Bigambo, who's a governance expert, and we have Uriri, Member of Parliament, Mheshimiwa Mark Nyamita. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on The Big Story this evening. Javas, allow me to begin with you. Listening in to the back and forth on secession from the leaders, and Sophia Onuna has just had a conversation with Aden Duale, leader of majority. What goes through your mind? Are there genuine concerns, or people are trying to settle political scores?
Well, listening to the discussion that has been given by the leader of majority, Aden Duale, it is clear that as a nation, it's important for us to start having a conversation around what does this secession really mean, and what are the implications of this, and if we're to look at the very theories that inform matter secession around the world, whether we look at the theories that informed matter secession in Quebec, whether we look at matters of secession that informed the matters of the Catalanians or Sumta, etc., or even some of the realities of secession that have happened on the African continent. For example, in 1991, in May 1991, we had Eritrea gain its own independence. When you look at, for example, a couple of years ago, we had the case of secession of the South Sudan from the original Sudan. It tells you that critical issues to do with marginalization, to do with disenfranchisement, to do with are people feeling that they've been left behind for greater reasons in terms of their economic progress not being realized when they are still held within the huge block of the nationhood. Then also listening to the Nyatike Member of Parliament giving his own views, it tells you that as a nation in Kenya, we need to start asking ourselves, what is it that informs our nationhood? Does the center hold? Does the center of our nationhood hold together? The fact that the calls for secession are now arising. When you look at the discussion that was raised by the people of the MRC a couple of years ago, and the discussion now being revived by the governors of the coastal region about matter secession, then it tells you that it is important for us to start asking ourselves these difficult questions about our nationhood and whether indeed the pillars of nationhood are firm and alive in our time today.
And that would be a good place to bring in Uriri, Member of Parliament, Mheshimiwa Mark Nyamita. Mheshimiwa, could you let us know the reasons why the leaders from that specific region are now heading the direction of secession? Maybe you could paint the picture for us, for our viewers.
Thank you very much, Linda. You just had my colleague, I think a day before yesterday, 22 fishermen were actually arrested within this country. And they have been arrested by the police from Uganda. they have been arrested doing the economic activity that they know best, which is fishing. Today, you hear the Inspector General Boynet saying that if they did something wrong, it is okay for them to be arrested. What is he actually saying? That these people actually belong to Uganda. That today, if I did something wrong, it is okay for a police from Uganda to come and pick me and take me there. Then we're asking, which country do we belong to? Number two, you just heard my colleague say that every single morning there is a flag for Uganda that is actually raised in his own constituency, in this country. And this is not something that, I mean, the Migingo debate has not begun now. It has begun, I don't know how long ago. It was there when Saitoti was there. I remember at one point, I think Honorable Mr. Zotangula, when he was a Minister for Foreign Affairs, went across the borders to discuss this issue. It has never been actually resolved. But this is also the same government whereby we've had, and with all due respect to the people who are involved in the accident, when we had a team that was involved in an accident in Tanzania, on a road accident, we had them airlifted. Within 2 minutes, there was a chopper going across the borders to actually see what has happened to Kenyans. And we were all happy because those are our fellow Kenyans. If something terrible happens for them in a different country, it needs to be resolved. This is not only happening in Nyatike, it is happening in Mbita. These people come and raid. Maybe you didn't show part of the statement. I remember my colleague, Millie Odhiambo, was telling us today. They go and take money from even businessmen and walk across with it, when our Kenyan police are actually walking. In fact, our Kenyan police that are at the very islands have begun doing business with them. So what we are asking is, even if my colleague is talking about secession, clearly the government has already seceded us. The government has already moved us across the border. If our own Inspector General of Police is saying, if those people had a mistake, it is okay for them to actually be arrested. But when you talk about the issue of, and I had the majority leader talk about Article 5, that the president, about the territorial boundaries of the country, both on land and water. The question is, are they protecting that? Just the other day, when they wanted to carry out elections, or when they wanted to carry out what they call elections, we saw the power of government. I mean, there is no single artillery, machinery that was not sent down to the very county. We are asking now, we have lives that actually are at risk in a different jurisdiction. Then later on, and I'm sure you've been privy to, the discussions that have been going on. After they came, killed, hit our people, the next thing we were seeing one of the Jubilee governors from Nairobi coming and pretending now that he wants to rescue the people. Yeah.
Allow me to just chip in a little bit, because this is not a problem that began yesterday. This is a problem that has been there for years. And then someone would ask the question, if this is a problem that's between Kenya and Uganda, where is the conversation about secession coming in? And I'll give you the chance to respond to that. Allow me now to take a break, then I'll come back to you, then maybe you can explain that to us as well. All right, you're watching The Big Story. Let's take that break. You can be part of this conversation. Please use the hashtag #TheBigStory. Then we can be able to track some of the conversations online. Let's take that break now.